Howdy y'all, it's your favorite trainer with a belt buckle. Today we're going to help you pass the CSCS. This is the Strength and Conditioning 4th edition. We're helping people pass that. If you're not familiar with Show Up Fitness, we teach great trainers in person, Santa Monica, West Hollywood, and San Diego. In person, online, the World Wide Web. If you haven't read the book, How to Become a Successful Personal Trainer, I know you're going to become a strength coach, but let us help you pass the CSCS. We have a study guide. Don't waste a bunch of time. 1, 2, 3 months max. That's all you need. The study guide is going to trim out all the fat. I've been a strength coach for over 5 years. I have my degree in kinesiology, went to the University of Connecticut for an internship there as well. This is good stuff, but elephant in the room, you still don't get the hands-on learning. It's hard, but we got a bunch of nerds getting out there that can't communicate with athletes. Come on, bro, you gotta put some size on if you want to be a strength coach. You're working with athletes. Sure, you could be working with some runners, the physiology, the application, super important, but there's also that hands-on part, but you don't care about that. Let's get into this. Chapter 1 is what we're gonna review today. So this is gonna be starting on page 1. Let's get into the skeletal system. So the basic unit, the osteon, osteoporosis, porous bones. Osteon is the basic unit. 206 bones. We have the axial and then the appendicular. Appendicular is everything coming out of the axial. So the axial is going to be like your mandible, your maxilla, your temporal bones. You got 2 of them. Parietal, 2 of them. Occipital, frontal. 8 total bones in the skull. 33 in the vertebrae. 7 in cervical. 12 thoracic. 5 in the lumbar region, the lowest region. Then we have 9 fused bones in the sacrum and the coccyx. They're not going to ask you much on like specific bones or even muscles or neurons. Let me ask you like a tendon or ligament. So think of your Achilles tendon, it's your gastroc and your soleus going into that connective tissue into your calcaneus. That's your heel bone. A ligament, your ACL, anterior front side cruciate. Cruciate in Latin is cross, and ligament is bone to bone. So you could just read chapter 1 time. Don't get too lost into it. A motor unit is a neuron and all the associated muscle fibers it innervates. That's a good term to know. When you look at the myofilaments with actin and myosin, myosin is the larger one, it goes into actin. Let's take a look at when it comes to the physiology portion. They like to ask you about calcium. That's something you're going to see. So like on page 6, underline which term, talking about the sarcoplasmic reticulum, which terminates as vesicles in the vicinity of the Z lines. Calcium ions are stored in these vesicles. The regulation of calcium controls muscular contraction. And then over here it talks about the resting phase. The next page talks about the contraction phase and the relaxing phase. If you really want to nerd out on this stuff to really understand calcium, calcium is going to bind on troponin, which will then allow for tropomyosin to uncover so myosin can go into actin. And that's going to be the siding filament theory. So for your own knowledge, it's a lot more valuable to get into fiber types on page 9. Here's a little example of Hinneman's size principle. You can check this sucker out. I do have a video on it. Come on, here we go. Here we go. There we go. So we have up here the big powerful type 2 X fibers, and you have your 2 A's, and then your type 1 muscles. Just remember 1 aerobic. They have a lot of mitochondria. That's where ATP is produced. They have a high capillary density. They have a lot of oxygen. They're fat specific, whereas type 2 are going to be more carb specific. And that's going to be quickly fatiguing. Think of more proximal, so closer to the midline. My chest is more type 2. My quads are more type 2. Closest to the midline, distal, further away, gastroc, soleus, more type 1. All muscles have a combination of type 1 and type 2. Think of sprinters, they're jacked, they got big old biceps. They're more type 2 specific. Or endurance runners have more type 1, so they're training in the 12 plus rep range. You should know the percentages, so 15 reps, what's that percentage? Roughly 65. 8 reps, 80% of your 1 rep max. You should definitely write out 1 to 20 and know what those numbers correspond with. And then when we look at the examples like table 1.2, we really get in this in our study guide. We tell you the words that you need to know. You don't need to have 50 vocab words per chapter. Focus on the 10, 12 that are important ones. In chapter 1, you're not going to get a lot. Muscle spindles, Golgi tendon, those are good to know. So like on 12, it talks about the Golgi tendon. As tension in the muscle increases, discharge of the GTO increases. So knowing what the Golgi tendon does. when you look at heart anatomy, don't get too hung up on the heart. Let's actually use one of these whiskey bottles. So this is probably the first time you've ever seen the heart compared to a whiskey bottle. So we have two chambers, the upper ones, those are going to be your atriums. The bottom ones are your ventricles. We have a septum, which would be like this book, like your nose septum, that separates the right and left side. So what that does is it doesn't allow the right and left side to have discharge going back and forth. So blood is going to flow in. All arteries carry oxygen. Sorry, I screwed that one up. All arteries go away from the heart. All veins go to the heart. Now, the exception to the rule for oxygen and deoxygenated blood, that's what I mentioned earlier, is going away. You're going to have arteries, but the pulmonary arteries carrying deoxygenated blood. Now, going back to the heart on the left side, I take a breath. Oxygen is hopping on when you look at your bronchioles, your alveoli, and then your capillaries around your alveoli, which allow for exchange through diffusion on the red blood cells. You're going to have oxygen coming back to the heart via your pulmonary vein. Rich blood gets dumped off into the atrium, the holding chamber, and then it's going to go through the bicuspid valve into the lower chambers, which are the pumping chambers. That's going to be your ventricles. And then via your aorta valve, it's going to come out in the backside, aorta arch, and it's going to go throughout the rest of the body. And then what you're going to have is you have your, think of this as more like your arteries. The right side is going to be your veins. So then you're going to have your arteries going into the capillaries, which will then come to capillaries and then through your veins. And so on page they will ask you something like on 14, when you get your arteries into your arterioles, into the capillaries, into the venules, into the veins, the flow of blood, where it's coming back into the inferior, superior vena cavas, and it drops it off in the right atrium through the tricuspid valve, and then into the right ventricle. Contraction takes place through the pulmonary artery, the pulmonary vein, and then we have the artery going away, and that is blood flow. 1 to 3 questions max. They do like to ask about the SA node, so knowing what that does is beneficial. Besides that, don't get too hung up. Again, key terms, they're going to give you like maybe 50 or so, maybe even 100 in chapter 1. Don't flashcard them all, just know the important ones. We will, so stay tuned at the end of this video. We have Dr. Chaliwa, he's a professor. He's gonna go through a normal EKG and what the repolarization and depolarization mean. It's really important, I think, as a strength coach to, when you're learning this stuff, is understand the why, but to have the right people that you can source out and ask questions to. So we have a professor that comes on our Zoom calls twice a week. Our program online is 2 months. It's $100 per month. You get access to us. You get our study guide. We have a professor. We have a registered dietitian. You get to ask questions. That's really important. But more importantly, is we're giving you the keys for long-term success so you can start with your network and get into being a strength coach. Let's go over a couple of questions at the end to see how you did on this one. So study question 1, then I'll go over a few on the study guide. Which of the following substances regulates muscle actions? So that word substance, I'm going to cross off troponin and tropomyosin because those are proteins. And then we have calcium and potassium. As I said earlier, calcium is going to be part of the muscular contraction. So calcium would be the answer for that one. Number 2, which of the following substances acts at the neuromuscular junction to excite the muscle fibers of a motor unit? Remember, a motor unit is a neuron, which is the basic unit for the nervous system. The sarcomere is the basic unit for the muscular system. Osteon for bones. So we have the motor unit is a neuron, which is the basic unit. All the muscle fibers it innervates. So acetylcholine is where it begins. That's the whole process begins in the brain. It goes down the whole process. ATP, this is an easy question because associate ATP with creatine phosphate. So you can just cross those two off. When I'm doing a sprint, when I'm doing a bicep curl, I'm breaking down adenosine triphosphate. So you have adenosine molecule and 3 phosphates. Now we'll just do a bunch of whiskey bottles. I got a couple of them here. So this sucker is adenosine. And now we have 3, got a lot of whiskey. I like whiskey, get over it. Adenosine, 3 phosphate molecules. When I break off this last phosphate, what you do is you have energy. You have inorganic phosphates floating around in hydrogen ions. Now we have adenosine diphosphate. We also have a cool little thing floating around, another one, and that's going to be, 4 bottles now. And this is creatine phosphate. This will then bind with the diphosphate to create another adenosine triphosphate molecule, so more work can be done. So that's the cool thing about creatine, is you're saturating the muscle with more creatine phosphate molecules, which will allow for contraction to take place. So there's my little ATP analysis with whiskey. So those two we want to look at for, cross them off, ATP and creatine phosphate. Serotonin is going to be a hormone. It's not related to a muscular contraction, so acetylcholine will be the final answer. 3 I just went over, Golgi tendon, figure 1.0. SA node is the pacemaker. And then at the end of this video, we'll get the answer for 5, which is why is it B? All right, so our study guide, I tell you the terms to know, so type 1 and type 2. Again, we teach this twice per week, Mondays and Wednesdays, Thursdays, depends on the schedule. 1 hour live Zoom calls. Brock Littler, he has been in the industry for over, I think, 10 years now. He has his master's in sports psychology, played football at Colgate. Dude is super, super smart. He's in control of this. You get to ask him questions on Monday. I do Wednesdays. We're going to get you to pass this 2-3 months max. We just had someone do it who didn't have that in-depth of a background, crushed it, and he said he was so thankful for the guy because it just eliminated a lot of the fat. You know, if we're trying to memorize conversion of joules and watts and newtons and all that stuff, relax. First off, it's one question. You're not going to get quizzed on that. But don't try to memorize these conversions for weeks and get all that mumbo jumbo in your brain. Focus on the important charts. So how much a linebacker can bench versus a DB, and they're 40 times. Those are things that you're going to be tested on. Basketball, girls, volleyball. Knowing those specific charts, which we tell you to focus on in the textbook. So chapter 1, the questions, some of those vocab words. It's just good to know the difference between bradycardia and tachycardia. Tachy is greater than 100, brady is less than 60. Just for your own resources as well. You should know the difference between systolic and diastolic. Systolic is the top number, the bottom number is diastolic, so how hard the heart contracts and how hard it relaxes. We need pressure to get oxygen to the brain and circulate through our most distal areas. And as I mentioned earlier with actin and myosin, and so question 1 would be, which of the following bones is part of the axial skeleton? The calcaneus, the patella, or T4? T4 is your thoracic region. That is part of the axial skeleton, so that would be the answer. Which valve is also known as the bicuspid? It's the mitral valve. It's going to be on the left side, between the left atrium and the left ventricle. Which of the following athletes has more type 1 than type 2 fibers? Now, these are good ones because, remember, you're going to get 3 answers. There are a lot of times you're going to be the best answer. There may be 2 answers that could be right, but we want to find the best answer. So, more type 1 muscle fibers than 2. Soccer player, basketball player, 50-meter sprinter, or a 50-meter swimmer. So, basketball and swimming, 50 meters at least, are going to be very close to ATP PC, so 0 to 30 seconds. I look at bioenergetics and I call them the 5 gears. So gear 1 is ATP, which is going to be 0 to 10 seconds. Gear 2, 10 to 30, which is phosphagen and using creatine. Gear 3 is fast glycolysis. Gear 4 is slow glycolysis. So fast glycolysis will be like 30 seconds to 2 minutes. Slow glycolysis, 2 to 3 minutes. And then oxidation, which will be gear 5. I produce the greatest amount of ATP, gear 1. I get the most ATP from gear 5. So the greatest rate, how quickly I can do it, that's ATP. And then the most is going to be the most economical, which would be gear 5. Quick little bioenergetics breakdown for you. So for this one, a swimmer that's doing a 50-meter sprint, as well as a basketball player, those are going to be the same. So a soccer player does have type 2, and anaerobic metabolism and endurance is really important to have for that sport, but it's going to be more type 1 recruitment. Which of the following athletes has more slow twitch muscle fibers than fast? 100-meter sprinter, a wrestler, or triple jumper? Wrestlers need to be powerful, explosive, throwing people around, but how long is the match? That's going to be more oxidative, where a triple jumper is going to be less than 10 seconds. 100-meter sprinter, 9 seconds, 9.58 for Bolt to, world-class time, 10:1. Less than 10 obviously is amazing. 10 to 10.5, so slow people, 12 plus. Those are going to be more in type 2, whereas wrestling would be type 1. So slow twitch is going to be more aerobic. Last but not least, which of the following is the most superficial part of the muscle? So we have our muscle, superficial is just going to be on top of. The prefix epi is going to be on top, on. The endomyasm is going to be inside, and perimyasm, so we'll go epi, and then peri, and then endo. That's going to be the hierarchy for those. So hopefully this was helpful for you. Again, stick around for a few more minutes. I'm going to link another video in here from Dr. Chaliwa. We want you to pass this thing 1 to 3 months so you can get out there and start gaining experience. Even if you're a strength coach, check out my book, How to Become a Successful Personal Trainer, because I interview a lot of strength coaches in here. Brett Bartholomew, Brett Contreras, Tony Gentilcore. If you want to be successful, this is the first step. Don't go seeking all these certifications, wasting all this time. Oh my God, that guy says you shouldn't get certs. Well, why are you getting the cert? You just need one in strength and conditioning, the CSCS, that's it. I'm not saying you shouldn't continue learning. You should. You should know a ton about your anatomy, movement, and how to programming. That's the second step. So get this over with. Let us help you. Shoot us a DM on Instagram, Show Up Fitness Internship. Make sure to like and subscribe. And remember, I'm your favorite trainer with a belt buckle. Whew. Have a great day, y'all. We have SA node versus AV node. And, we've gone over, cardiorespiratory anatomy. And the question is about why is the AV node even necessary or important?
That's a good question. And, well, I shouldn't have taken this stuff down. Let me bring it back
to the board.
Back up to the board for a second. I don't know why I even sit down.
I think this is one of the first talks you've given that you haven't had a drink next to you. I like it. I got to go get a drink. It's 5 o'clock in the East Coast, so it's fine.
Yeah, it is. I'm trying not to kill all my post-exercise protein synthesis. So bear in mind, I am a terrible artist. And I try in exercise phys when I was a new professor at Coastal, like 7 years ago, I tried to draw a flexing bicep and it looked like a cock and balls on the board. So my illustrations are not going to be very good.
That's all right.
Well, we have the heart, and we have the 4 chambers of the heart. We have the atria, right and left, and then the ventricles, right and left. And if you went over heart anatomy, you know there's a valve between the atria and the ventricles. It's a one-way valve. And if we know the steps of blood flow through the heart, we know that blood is returned to the atria through the pulmonary artery and through the, oh crap, I'm drawing a huge blank. What's the name of the vein, the big vein?
The inferior and superior vena cava.
Yeah, the vena cava, thank you. And during diastole, the atria fill with blood. And at the end of diastole, the atria inject their blood into the ventricles. The AV valve closes, and during systole, the ventricles contract and eject their blood either into the pulmonary vein. So yeah, the pulmonary vein or the aorta, respectively. So we know this. The AV valve, SA node, sinoarterial node, it's about right there. And the sinoarterial node serves 2 functions. Its first function is to send a signal to the atria, telling the atria to contract, to push their blood into the ventricles. Its second function is to delay the signal so that the whole heart doesn't contract as one. Because what we want to happen is we want the atria to push blood into the ventricles and to really pressurize those ventricles. So we need to have a delay. And then the AV node acts as an amplifier because the ventricles have a lot more muscle mass, cardiac muscle mass, than the atria. So the AV node will stimulate the ventricles to contract. So collectively, these two nodes regulate the heart contractions.
Okay. Yep. So Ryan, did you have any other follow-ups on that? I wanted to hop into because they parlay off one another about depolarization and repolarization. And can you touch on those a little bit?
Yes.
I remember we had a class, I think it was XPhys, that we went through the EKG and all that fun stuff, and that's not me.
So are we talking depolarization and repolarization of skeletal muscle or the heart? Because it's
Of the heart specifically.
What's that?
Of the heart.
Of the heart specifically. All right. It's been a while since I've taught the heart, so let's just go over depolarization and repolarization in simple terms first, and then we can see if we need what type of more detail we need to go into.
Okay.
So we have an excitable tissue. That could be a nerve or muscle tissue, skeletal or cardiac. And that tissue exhibits a certain charge. For skeletal muscle, it's usually -70 millivolts. That charge is created by an ionic difference. So in skeletal muscle, we know that potassium is the major intracellular electrolyte, sodium is the major extracellular electrolyte. There is a higher concentration of sodium in the extracellular fluid compared to potassium in the intracellular fluid. So this difference in concentration, much greater positive charge outside compared to inside, is what gives us this resting membrane potential, or this charge of -70 millivolts. Now, for a tissue to react to an electrical signal, it needs to be able to change its charge or to depolarize. And this occurs through the exchange of charged particles, in this case, sodium and potassium. So during depolarization, sodium enters the cell through sodium gates. And that entrance of sodium then brings all these positively charged ions into the cell, causing this value to change. So as a result of that, all the sodium now entering the cell and being in a high concentration, the charge of the muscle cell increases. That charge then elicits a number of secondary effects, such as the release of calcium, and that release of calcium leads to excitation-contraction coupling, or the shortening of a muscle in contraction. So this is depolarization. Now, to accept another signal, that muscle cell needs to return to this -70 millivolts. It does this in two processes. One is passive, one is active. So the first part of this process is potassium exits the cell, lowering the charge. This is passive. And then the active process, requiring energy, is potassium is brought back in exchange for sodium being pumped out, so that it can return to this -70 millivolts and accept another action potential or another signal to contract.
Now, Brian, do you want more? Someone's asking about what happens with the QRS and the reading with that.
Yeah, Juan just wanted to say just what happens with a QRS wave reading.
Okay. So we're talking now about an EKG.
Yep.
And the most common lead kind of looks like this. Q wave. On an EKG diagram. Wait a second. Let me back up here. There we go. So what's happening is we have these electrodes placed on us. These electrodes read an electrical charge. And we know that if we draw, for example, the ventricles of the heart, the electrical signal spreads from the AV node to various parts of the ventricles, causing them to contract. Now, depending upon where those electrodes are placed will dictate what this looks like. However, what's happening here is when an electrical signal is moving toward an electrode, it is causing the charge or the reading to go up. And when an electrical signal is moving away from an electrode, it's causing the reading to go down. So if we have an electrode, let's say right here on the heart or near the heart, what's happening is this P wave represents the atria depolarizing, or a change in the charge in the atria. This would correspond with atrial contraction. The QRS represents the ventricles contracting. And because the ventricles are a larger mass than the atria, we typically see this as a much larger wave. So the QRS represents the ventricles contracting, and based upon where the electrode is placed, let's say right here, some of this shows the signal going away from it. Some of it shows the signal spreading to the greater mass of the electrode and going toward, or the greater mass of the ventricle and going toward that electrode. And some of it shows it going away. At the very end of this, we have what's known as the T wave, where the ventricles themselves repolarize.
And that's just going to go into what we were talking about earlier with the repolarization.
Correct.
Yeah, and that kind of why I know, because I know one of the questions we had, we asked is basically which electrical occurrences are undetectable during a normal EKG, and it was atrial repolarization. And is it because it's smaller than these we're talking about right now, correct?
Yeah, what's happening is atrial repolarization is essentially being masked by all this electrical activity that's occurring in the ventricles.
Yeah, makes sense.
So that's kind of like, I guess, a general healthy one. So say we were an EMT, what is something that we may look at that like, oh shit, this is trouble? Or what's something irregular that may occur? Is it the spacing of it going up and down more? How could this be more applied, I guess, to the real world?
So what are some deviations that might imply some sort of
Yeah.
concern?
Yeah.
Okay.
Just so I can understand, like, with variations, what would be the difference? I guess it help me a deeper understanding of it.
All right. So one of what you might look at is what's known as the ST complex. And this is the switch from depolarization to the repolarization of the ventricles. And so if the ST is depressed, so instead of coming back to the baseline, instead if it looks kind of depressed like this, I know I'm not drawing that correctly. If the ST is depressed, then that could be a sign of a previous myocardial infarction, so some sort of dead heart tissue. And then if the ST, which normally should look baseline, E wave, etc., is elevated, depending upon what lead you're looking at, so it looks like this, that can be a sign of a myocardial infarction. So
these waves give you a map, could give you a map, almost like a GPS system of what's going on in the heart.
Correct. And depending upon what lead, so you normally get a 12 lead EKG, and each lead is going to look different because the electrode is placed in a different spot on the chest. And so depending upon what lead you're looking at and you're seeing these deviations in, you can approximate what area of the heart there is either some sort of previous tissue damage due to a myocardial infarction, or where there is presently some ischemia occurring. And then the other thing that we might look for, in addition to the ST, is an inverted T wave. So normally the T wave should look like that. However, if the T wave is inverted, that's also a sign of heart disease. Now, there's a lot that you can deduce from an EKG. You can look for arrhythmias, such as AFib as well. You can look for various fibrillations where either the heart isn't contracting correctly. But the most common is looking at this ST complex. Elevated, depressed, or inverted T wave.
Does that help one?
Yes, sir.
We're heart experts now, so we can start doing heart surgery. And
electrocardiography was like the worst class for me in grad school, because it is really a talent and an art to be able to interpret those EKG readings.
Yeah, especially when you get like tacky and you get a bunch of crazy stuff going on. It's you're a mad scientist.
Yeah. It's really easy to like draw an inverted T wave or depression or elevation on this basic basic reading, but when you start looking at all the different readings, it is really something to see people that can just look at it like that and make a decision.
So heart surgeons know a little bit. Another area that we get a lot of questions on, and I always just tell them I failed physics 3 times, is the